Now, here in the United States, a new wave of Black Lives Matter protests are beginning around the country, from here in a rainy New York right across to Portland, Oregon, at the killing of a young black man by police. The Minnesota police chief says the officer who fired the shot which killed Daunte Wright had intended to fire a taser, not a handgun, calling it an accidental discharge. The 20-year-old was killed during a traffic stop just a few miles from the Minneapolis courtroom where former police officer Derek Chauvin is on trial for the murder of George Floyd. Protests led to clashes last night in an area where tensions were already running high as the trial enters its 11th day. Fury has erupted again in Minneapolis. Police firing tear gas, stun grenades and rubber bullets to disperse hundreds of people on the streets in disbelief that just a few miles from where Officer Derek Chauvin is on trial for the murder of George Floyd, police had shot and killed another black man.
He was only 20 years old and he didn't deserve to be shot and killed like this. I don't want everybody out here chanting and screaming and yelling. I just want him home. That's it.
20-year-old Daunte Wright had been pulled over driving the car his parents had just given him. Calling his mother for help, he told her it was because he had air fresheners dangling from his rear-view mirror.
Then I heard the police officer come to the window and say, "Put the phone down and get out of the car." And Daunte said, "Why?" And he said, "We'll explain to you when you get out of the car." And I heard scuffling, and I heard the police officer say, "Daunte, don't run." And then the other officer said, "Put the phone down," and hung it up. A minute later, I called, and his girlfriend answered, which was the passenger in the car, and said that he'd been shot. She put it on the driver's side, and my son was laying there lifeless.
Police say officers discovered an outstanding warrant and that he was shot getting back into his vehicle, that he drove on and then crashed. His girlfriend was injured.
This appears to me, from what I viewed and the officer's reaction and distress immediately after, that this was an accidental discharge that resulted in the tragic death of Mr. Wright.
The shock at another police killing so close to where George Floyd was killed last year was immediate, and some people marched towards a police station. There was some damage and looting of shops.
Police! Anybody in the building? Come out now with your hands in the air!
A curfew was declared and the National Guard has been called in to try to stop a repeat of last year in Wisconsin, when a similar police shooting of Jacob Blake led to days of protest and huge amounts of damage.
Open the door, get out the car!
It comes amid outrage at video released of police in Virginia who are being sued for the way they treated a serving black Army lieutenant in a traffic stop last December.
Yeah, dude, you should be. Get out! Get out!
Get out the car!
Get out now!
Karen Nazario was threatened at gunpoint. When he asked for explanations, he was pepper sprayed, dragged out of his car and put down on the ground.
Put your hands behind your back.
The officer, who has since been fired, declaring he often has a problem with people from minorities during traffic stops.
And I realize there's civil unrest, and maybe some of the jurors did hear about that.
In Minneapolis, on day 11 of the trial of Derek Chauvin, the judge dismissed an attempt by the defense to draw last night's events into the case by isolating the jury in response.
Correct.
He ruled that what happened was a separate matter.
I think the better way is to just continue with the trial as we've been going.
The prosecution brought another doctor, a cardiologist, to testify that George Floyd died because of the way Derek Chauvin restrained him, kneeling on his neck.
In addition to not putting him in that position in the first place, when there were signs that he was worsening, repositioning him, I think very likely would have also saved his life.
This was Belton Brace's testimony before the defense gets to work this week. But with this latest police killing last night, a new round of Black Lives Matter and No Justice, No Peace protests are expected here, with a great deal at stake way beyond Minneapolis. Well, I'm joined now by the political strategist Latosha Brown, who's co-founder of the Black Voters Matter organisation. As you look to what has happened in Minneapolis, so close to where George Floyd was killed last year, what are you thinking?
It's as activists have been saying, there is a larger structural problem. That this isn't about, oftentimes these cases, we're looking at these cases as if they're individual incidents, like they're isolated incidents. And yes, there was one bad police officer that did an inaction. What we're seeing is, as we're seeing these videotapes, as we're seeing what happened last night, is that there is structural racism embedded within the police force in this nation, in this country, that disproportionately impacts Black people different than everybody else. That in some way, Black men are often in something that could be an innocent or literally could be resolved very differently. It winds up becoming a deadly incident. And so there is a larger issue around institutionalized racism that is embedded in the policing in this country. That's what it points to.
And do you think the context of a different presidency makes any difference?
I do. I think that the context around what we're seeing is that not only we're seeing kind of the structural racism, but we're also seeing that there has been a culture developed within the policing in this country that literally says that Black lives don't matter. That there has been it's interesting that we've witnessed the mass killing, mass murders and mass killing of all across this country that's been led by white shooters. Somehow the police has been able to offer some restraint, be able to provide some due process, and so they're taken in and literally are given the opportunity to have trial. But oftentimes in these cases, that what we're seeing, when Black folks are stopped, particularly Black men, but when Black people are stopped, there's no due process. That for some way they're jumped over the process from they're stopped and then they're murdered, right? And so that's why we know that we've got to deal with structural racism in this country, and particularly in how it is embedded in the culture of the policing in America.
Indeed, I mean, that happened in Georgia, where you are, where a self-confessed mass killer was arrested without any shots being fired. But Georgia is also in the news here because of the attempts to change the voter registration laws, which will adversely affect Black voters. What's going on there?
Absolutely. So what we're seeing in Georgia is that in this last election cycle, in 2020, you had a historic turnout of voters, that you had the highest number of Black voters ever in the history of the state that actually showed up, not only in the general election, but in the runoff election. The thing that's interesting about that is that the runoff election itself as a process was designed to actually have the opposite impact, that there would be a deep drop off of Black voters. Instead, what we saw is an uptick and an uprise of Black voters showing up in historic numbers. And so what we've seen shortly after that is that the legislature, the Republican-controlled legislature, they control the governor's house, they control the Senate and the House, that what they did is they actually started looking at legislation to start what I think is punitive, to punish voters who participated in this last election cycle. As a result, there was the passage of SB 202, which was a bill that came out that does some severe restriction, as a voter suppression bill is what we're calling it, because it has some measures in that bill that actually restrict access to the ballot. It also gives the GOP the authority to be able to take over the results by literally taking over the board of election on the county level. And so it is some egregious pieces that it even criminalizes people of organizations that are actually helping people, giving them water and snacks that have been standing in line 3, 6, 5, whatever hours. Really, it criminalizes them. And so this is a bill that was designed to attack Black voters. It's designed to restrict access to the ballot. Is designed to actually put a restraint and barriers on those that have been assisting folks to stand in line.
Latosha Brown, thank you very much indeed for joining us.